Taking the bull by the horns? Or did Greece's left-wing government just cave in faster than usual? There were bitter protests in Athens and Thessaloniki against harsh new tax and pension reforms. This leading up to a vote in Parliament that's aimed at preempting reform demands that are part of a standoff with creditors on debt relief. All sides have known for a long time that Greece can't pay back the sums borrowed first by the banks and by fellow states in the IMF. Even the funds rooting for debt relief at this point, but not the Germans, it seems, although now there's an open split with Angela Merkel's grand coalition on the matter. What is a fair deal for all sides? What's changed in 9 years of crisis? And does Greece see the light at the end of the tunnel? Also, is the Eurozone any better equipped to withstand another crisis? Today, in the France 24 debate, it's payback time again in Greece. And with us from Athens is Yanis Palaiologos, author of The 13th Labor of Hercules. Welcome back to the show. Welcome back from Hania in Crete, an economist who's thought long and hard about the pros and cons of the Eurozone, Yanis Koutsoumidis. And from London, Alberto Gallo, portfolio manager at Algebris Investments. Welcome to all of you, the France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation, and you have on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24Debate. Greece and its EU IMF creditors to reach a deal to release the next tranche of bailout money in the coming days. That's according to an EU commissioner speaking just a few hours ago. The relief, though, comes at a cost, as protesters rioted outside amid a general strike. 3 votes was the margin inside Parliament as the left-wing Syriza government narrowly got approval on those reforms. The Prime Minister accused of betraying his electoral base, but it seems that Alexei Tsipras prefers to weather this storm than the one he faces in July, when his government has to make a €2.3 billion debt repayment.
We are determined at all costs to make Greece stand on its feet again and to break this abscess of corruption that was governing all these years and led the country to bankruptcy. And we will do it.
It's another year with the same movie repeating itself. It's been playing for the last 6 years. Every year, pensions and salaries go down, while taxes increase, employer contributions increase, everything increases. I don't know where this is going to lead.
They didn't do what they said they would. And now people have to decide what's next. No one's paying attention to the strikes, neither on one side or the other. We need a revolution. Seriously, my politics were in the center, but now I'm thinking of going towards the extremes. I'm so outraged.
Yanis Palaiologos, your reaction to that 58-year-old unemployed man saying that no one's paying attention anymore when there's a general strike, we need a revolution?
Well, I think if you consider what has happened to my country over the last 6-7 years, we're talking about a country that's been in recession basically uninterruptedly for 8 years. It's been forced to take austerity measures, very harsh ones, continuously over 6 years. And the economy hasn't recovered. People are still losing their jobs. Unemployment is at 25% and has been there for 4 years now. So it's no surprise, really. If anything, it's surprising that the extremes are not doing even better.
It's surprising that the extremes aren't doing better, could they?
Well, I mean, it will depend on how things evolve over the coming years. But my concern is that the bailout recipe that we are following now is the same failed one that we followed between 2010 and 2015. Therefore, I don't see how this is going to lead to a strong recovery. If you add to that the fact that this government is quite hostile to the private sector and private investment, I don't see how, even if they're able to complete this review, things will become noticeably better over the next few years. So yes, I am concerned.
Yanis Koutsoumidis, you agree there is no light at this point at the end of the tunnel?
Well, the light at the end of the tunnel will come if the European partners in the Eurozone start to fund the Greek economy. The Greek economy is out of funds for virtually the last 6 years. There are enterprises, there are good companies in Greece that cannot fund their activities. There are shops closing down because they can't get hold of a small loan of 10,000 euros. There are companies laying off people because they can't afford their payrolls. So we have a fiscal crisis, we have a confidence crisis, and also we have a liquidity crisis. Well, the liquidity can be somehow solved if all these measures that the bailout agreement of last July come into fruition. That means the ECB should put Greece back in its funding activities, put the waiver back for the Greek banks, start funding private state corporations and also private corporations too, and also the Juncker plan. If there is real investments in Greece and new jobs created, maybe some confidence will come back. But overall, the sentiment is how Yannis described it. There is real resentment. People are fed up with this situation for all these years. And this is a very critical point of how to turn back confidence into people's hearts and minds.
Were you surprised to see Alexis Tsipras quick to go through with that reform this time? I say he did it before this Monday meeting in Brussels.
Well, this agreement had to be concluded until the end of 2015. We're already 5 months behind schedule. But what we need to take into account here is that Mr. Tsipras, his political calculator, he tries to minimize the effect that all these measures have on his political clientele. That means all these people that voted for him and believed that he can change the narrative of the Eurozone and have less austerity and have the Greek debt cut at least 50%. That was the initial strategy back in 2015. Now he sees all these arguments that they cannot be viable. He even said yesterday, he admitted that he had delusions that he could win over the Eurozone. So it's a big change of mentality also for the big Greek political system, the Greek people. The Greek people believe that there is a third way out of austerity within the Eurozone, which is not possible. And now people tend to realize that this is the way that will happen for the next decades.
Not possible, even though there's growing calls for debt relief, even the head of the IMF saying you have to do it?
Yes, well, just a few minutes before we went into the studio, there were statements at the press conference at the Eurogroup saying that there won't be a comprehensive solution for the debt before 2018. So that means that Greece will be held hostage for the next 2 years at least. But we have to see the complete statements after the show to see what really happened during today's Eurogroup.
All right, let's bring in on this Alberto Gallo. Do you think that there won't be debt relief until 2018?
Well, you know, Greek debt is clearly unsustainable. I feel very sorry for Greece because this issue is being used as an example for the bigger chessboard of how Eurozone debt will be treated. We know that Greek GDP is 2% of the Eurozone. It's like a city like Milan or Dusseldorf. So the issue is solvable. The problem is to find the political will. Now, why 2018? Because next year, 2017, we have German and French elections. And German elections, you can already see in the polls that, you know, protest parties, Alternative for Germany, are gaining ground. So obviously German politicians are afraid that if they give too many concessions to Greece, then the electorate would turn against them. However, the longer a situation persists, the more you have, you know, high unemployment, a young generation of people that has no hope, and the more in Greece you can see that, you know, the extremist parties can gain ground. So we're on a we're walking a very fragile tightrope here. We know that Greek debt is unsustainable. There is a discussion around debt extension, so extensions of maturity. Now, we need to understand how significant these extensions are. We need to have at least something around 20, 30-year extension and potentially a reduction of interest or linking the interest to economic performance. We're basically facing a debtor that is not able to pay.
All right, let's talk about that. Greece's debt, it stands at 177% of GDP, 321 billion euros worth of red ink. Now it's nearly three-quarters owned by the euro area and the IMF. We can see on this graph with the Germans sitting on 40 billion worth of that debt. Alberto Gallo, there was in March of 2012 what they call in financial parlance a haircut. 53% of the debt with private creditors was written off. Why can't public creditors do the same?
That's the great political issue. In the private sector, if you have someone who has a mortgage and can't pay, you go to him, you talk to him, you negotiate. You're not going to get back 100. The loss is already there. But you try to get back 50 or maybe 60 cents on the euro. Now, with Greece, things are a lot more complicated because politicians in Germany and other countries don't want to be seen as giving them a gift, because they are afraid that otherwise other countries would ask for the same treatment. However, we know the loss is already there. We know that debt is at 175%. It's going to probably go above 200% if growth continues to be around zero, below zero, as it was in the last quarters. So you're looking at a debt to GDP ratio of over 20% with foreign creditors, without Greece having its own central bank. So you're almost at the level, you're getting close to Japan, basically, but Greece doesn't have the ability to print money. So we know we need to get a solution here. It's just that because of electoral issues in other countries, we want to kick the can a lot longer. Now, what I'm worried about is that at the moment, the politics are stable, but as we saw from the interviews, we may not be able to wait for 2 years because the politics could become fragile and people could go on the street. So I think that we need to start the negotiation with a debt extension and also a fiscal plan, like Yanis mentioned the Juncker plan, for example, which has been stagnating for over a year. The European Commission has only spent 10 billion in the Juncker plan over the last year and a half. 10 billion is 0.1% of Eurozone GDP, which is really not credible.
The Juncker plan, just to remind our viewers, which is this money that was set aside for stimulus for big infrastructure projects. You're saying, Alberto, a lot more could be done. A lot more could be headed towards places like Greece and towards Greece itself.
Well, across all Europe, really, because without fiscal policy, without an agreement to stimulate the economy, we're just going to remain stuck in a zero interest rate environment. But we know the ECB cannot do the trick by itself. The ECB doesn't have superpowers. And zero interest rates at some point fail to stimulate the economy because savers realize they're getting less on their savings, and so they spend less. So we need the fiscal arm, the political arm, to do something as well. Central banks have done all they can do already. And that's true for Greece, and it's true for the rest of Europe as well.
Yanis Palaiologos, what are you thinking when you hear, well, we got big elections in France and Germany next year, you'll have to wait till 2018?
Well, we're used to that story now. I tweeted something earlier about how, the first time that the Eurozone governments, under pressure from the IMF, committed to offer Greece more debt relief after the private sector haircut was in November 2012. And at that point, they said that, if Greece is able to achieve a primary surplus and continues to implement the program, then we will give it further debt relief. And in 2014, when Greece achieved the primary surplus the previous year, Germany and other countries basically backed out of that commitment. They made it again last summer. But there is a great suspicion here that, we're always being promised things on certain conditions, and these conditions are never met. And it's not because we don't meet them necessarily, but because the goalposts are always moved.
Yanis Koutsoumidis, is it the goalposts moving? Whose fault is it?
Well, I think all parties have their responsibilities because back in 2014, the previous Greek government was supposed to conclude the previous memorandum, but they were too afraid to go into real reforms and structural reforms and do the necessary austerity in order to conclude the agreement. So we had the snap elections of early 2015 with the Syriza government promising to uphold all these arrangements of the bailouts. So Greeks believed this narrative, and we came to the mid-2015 crisis. But what I think the way out of this crisis could be right now is basically ESM, the European Stability Mechanism, should be depoliticized. Right now, in every single decision that ESM has to take about debt of the Eurozone countries, some ministers or parliaments need to discuss very technical financial details. This has to become more technical. If a country fulfills conditionality, then the board of directors of the ESM should be able to make its debt more flexible. And we wouldn't have this discussion right now if all this debate wouldn't be so much politicized. Right now we have the head of the Social Democratic Party in Germany speaking against new austerity for Greece, the finance minister of Germany speaking for new austerity for Greece, other countries speaking for and against. This is like a babble in Europe. This has to end, otherwise it won't go anywhere. Right now, Greece has suffered so much that it needs a way out. And a new way out would mean more flexible terms for the debt. To give you an example, Greece has to fulfill 3.5% of GDP primary surplus for the next decades. This is, besides being totally unrealistic, it also takes away one of the key elements of the fiscal policy. Greece cannot have its own fiscal policy for the next decades. This is not reasonable. Fiscal policy should be counter-cyclical. In years that we have big growth, there should be more primary surplus achieved. And in years that we have maybe recession, we should be able to lower the targets. There should be more flexibility. Right now, it's so stiff, all this program, that it's totally unrealistic.
All right, cutting the debt is obviously at the heart of this discussion. A reaction on Twitter. Lawmakers passed painful reforms to reach fiscal targets, which they won't reach. For 6 years, we've been completely dried up of money. That's on the hashtag F24 debate. When we come back, we're going to look at that argument that's going on inside of the German Grand Coalition that Yanis was mentioning. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.